All right, good evening, everyone. Some of you may know me already, but for those who don't, my name is Robert Kotza. I am the Vice President of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, or as we also call it in shorthand, Goose. So this evening, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Dr. Andrew Reddie, who will be discussing analytical wargaming and behavioral research with us this evening. Before we get started, just a few quick procedural things. First, we'll just ask that all of you turn off your cameras and mics, both to save bandwidth and so we don't end up talking over one another. With that in mind, for the Q&A process, what we'll be doing is if you have any questions to ask Dr. Reddie throughout the presentation, just type those into the chat and then I will read them out loud to Dr. Reddie. He's going to stop at a few different points throughout his presentation. So again, whenever a question arises, just type it right into the chat and it'll definitely be addressed. And so with that, just a quick introduction. Dr. Andrew Reddie, tonight we'll be discussing the use of war games for social science research and efforts to address ensuing methodological challenges. He is currently a senior member of the technical staff at the Sandia National Laboratories. With that, Dr. Reddie, do you have anything else to add?
Oh, that's perfect. Thanks so much, Robert.
Perfect. It's all you.
Perfect. Thanks so much for all of you for attending. Afternoon here in California, evening for many of you on the East Coast. As Robert mentioned, I'm Andrew and definitely looking forward to today's discussion. As was mentioned, I'm more than happy to make this as much of a conversation as possible, and I'll do my best to track the chat and to address any questions as they come up. As we begin, the usual caveats apply. The views and opinions expressed during this presentation do not reflect those of the Department of Energy, Sandia National Laboratories, or the USG. So here in my personal capacity and looking forward to engaging with all of you, and so nice to see so many friendly names in the Zoom list here. So with that, let's get started. So apologies up top for the fairly provocative title, From Art to Science, Analytical Wargaming and Behavioral Research. I want to take today as an opportunity to kind of show some of the work that's already been done with my team at Sandia, at Lawrence Livermore and at UC Berkeley, and also talk a little bit about the work that we currently have underway. So many of you know our work from the Signal Wargame environment, and now we're onto our second one, and you know, definitely excited to talk about that with all of you today. So in terms of where these remarks are going, I want to spend a little bit a small amount of time talking about the challenge as I see it for those of us that are trying to use wargaming as an analytical tool. I'll talk a little bit about alternative data generating processes and how they relate to wargaming methods. I'll reflect a little bit on traditional wargaming methods and where we think that some of the more analytical or experimental applications of wargaming might be useful. We'll introduce what we're calling the Wargamers Trilemma, and really interested in your feedback on that particular idea as that article moves to publication. Talk a little bit about the data analysis and what I see is the kind of unique use cases for wargaming methods as a way to practice social science and ask the important questions of strategic studies, international security, international cooperation, etc. Of course, it's worth pointing out, as you'll see there on the right-hand side, that this, you know, my own involvement comes from my past at Lawrence Livermore as a pre-doc, UC Berkeley as both a former doctoral student and current postdoc, and that work was sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So a massive thanks to all of those institutions for bringing this work to the fore. So let's get started. Our challenge. One of the great challenges that are often reflected on in strategic studies and international security is that a lot of the questions that are most interesting to us do not have empirical data. So often we're asked the question of, well, how does technology X impact strategic stability? Or how does implementing strategy Y change arms race stability, or what have you? Using traditional methods of, say, observational data collected in a data set or case study comparison, right? We don't have that data to work with for those types of questions, which is a pretty significant challenge. And so, you know, there's a litany of theoretical pieces that talk about how hypersonic glide vehicles are likely to change the character of war, or how new AI tools are going to fundamentally alter the way that China and the United States relate to one another. But actually adjudicating those theoretical claims is very, very difficult to do in the absence of data with which to actually deal with the theoretical arguments. That's not to say that you can't have good theoretical arguments. Looking at people like Vipin Narang and Austin Long on the discrimination problem, for example, excellent work, but very difficult to actually adjudicate those theoretical claims empirically. And so our pitch, or my pitch, is that wargaming methods offer a particularly useful and in some ways unique tool to engage with those types of challenges as we look at, okay, what is an emerging technology? How is it going to impact the conduct of war? What is a new strategy doctrine? How is that going to impact the likelihood of escalation or what have you? And really do want to make the case that wargaming methods can play a role in filling this gap. And obviously, I come to this primarily as a political scientist. So in that way, I'm different from many of you in the audience, but certainly trying to take the best of the methods that have already been built on the wargaming side and apply those to the political science, international relations, international security space. So that's the kind of the challenge as I see it. And as I mentioned, in an ideal world, we would have empirical or observational data to engage on these questions. So we'd have case studies where a country had deployed a hypersonic glide vehicle, where we already had enabling technologies like pattern recognition tech and autonomy tech deployed in the world. And we can say, well, hey, if this country has it and this country doesn't, we're going to have trouble here in terms of escalation. Ideally, we'd have large N data in a time series over time with which to kind of adjudicate these claims, but we don't. And so traditionally, what social scientists like me have relied upon to actually look at these questions are what I call synthetic data generating processes, or DGPs. And these run the gamut from game theoretical models to more complicated formal models, to computer-based simulation and modeling techniques, all of which are very useful for making parsimonious theories about how the world works, but all of which tend to take the human out of the equation, which may or may not be appropriate from your perspective, depending on how you think about crisis decision-making. From my perspective, the human plays a pretty integral role in crises. And so DGPs that take the human out, I'm kind of essentially wary of from the outset. Survey experiments offer an alternative to synthetic DGP that keep the human in, and that's one of the major values of that methodology. And for any of you that are IR scholars in the room, you'll all know that we do a lot of leaning on survey methods to adjudicate the ways in which behavior might matter in international relations. Of course, the major problem with survey experiments is that when I give my research subject a piece of paper and I say, go read this vignette, and I manipulate them in a particular way with my treatment, maybe it's the addition of a capability, maybe it's changing some language in that vignette, there's no guarantee that, one, they're internalizing that treatment appropriately. They may, for example, be skimming it really quickly, and so the treatment's not really having much of an effect at all. Or two, they're just answering the survey completely randomly, right? It's a piece of paper that passes across their desk. That there's some concern there that we may not have a true reflection on what strategic decision-making looks like when it's put inside of a survey form. And so to address some of those foibles, if you will, of existing data generating processes, we've built out what's called sometimes experimental wargaming, experimental gaming, analytical wargaming. The moniker kind of shifts depending on who it is that we're talking to, but effectively trying to create a method that deals with the challenges that are associated with those DGPs. So having a methodological framework that keeps the human inside of it and doesn't ignore the fact that humans are essential to various questions that we're interested in with regards to conflict escalation or to using a particular weapon capability first or what have you. But also trying to create an environment where players are immersed inside of the game and we get a really good idea of what the core strategies are that players would operate inside of this game environment. So in some ways, you're taking the survey method and you're increasing the level of immersion that the research subjects are enjoying as part of a part of the DGP. And we can definitely come back to that particular slide in Q&A. I know there's often a lot of discussion around what are the various pros and cons across those DGPs. So traditional wargaming methods, I'm certainly not going to belabor this point among this audience. You all know this. But wargaming traditionally has been used for military applications, academic applications, education, training, occasionally practice, and more recently also analytical applications where you have an identified policy challenge that you're interested in. So here I'm thinking of the Baltic Sea or South China Sea or Black Sea scenarios. And oftentimes those identified policy challenges made into games have large game staffs and in-depth preparation, briefing books that are novel length, where you're putting high-level policymakers around a board or inside of a seminar, and you're taking them through a scenario. And of course, we've got colleagues that do this work all of the time. Sebastian's one of them, right at RAND, CNA, various Naval War College games are working similarly. And this has been the bedrock of the field of wargaming for the better part of 100 years. But there are challenges associated with the ways that we've traditionally done wargaming, right? So oftentimes these in-depth games are played only once. They're not replicated. Indeed, they can't be replicated in some cases because the way that the white cell behaves to actually move a seminar game from round to round is idiosyncratic, or it can be idiosyncratic. You also often tend to sample the same types of people over and over again, whether it be senior officials or when you can get them current officials. White cell education, as I mentioned, is an issue, and sponsorship bias is an issue. There are occasions in which we already know what the outcome is going to be as we design the war game, and that's a problem because obviously there you're not actually getting anything analytical out of the game. You're getting a preordained conclusion. With regards to data that you're getting out of the traditional war games, oftentimes data collection is incidental. You're relying on rapporteurs, kind of collecting the gist of the conversation. And we can argue about the best ways to do rapporteuring. I think laterally, because now we've shifted a lot of wargaming designs into distributed into a distributed format, we're actually able to collect more data than we did previously because we're collecting things like chat and recordings and what have you. But in any case, there are data challenges associated with this kind of more traditional way of doing wargaming. Oftentimes, data is also cloistered, particularly when it's done by the colleagues that I mentioned before. And indeed, occasionally that data is cloistered for good reason. One of the challenges from the academic side is when the game designs themselves are cloistered and kept away from the community, because subsequently we're not actually able to learn anything about laboratory effects across designs. And that's difficult from an academic perspective, because ideally you'd want to know what the laboratory effects are of having a 3-player game versus a 5-player game versus a 7-player game, or doing an analog game versus a digital game. And my hunch is that all of that information exists. It's just not in a shareable format. And of course, because by virtue of kind of who's doing wargaming, and it is because it's kind of inside of a consulting model, oftentimes wargame designs are treated as intellectual property. And so oftentimes you don't actually want to share designs. And again, that limits the amount of, our ability to kind of get to grips with the laboratory effects here. And yeah, to Brooks and Melody's point, that's exactly right. Yeah, security clearance issues are, loom large here. With that said, I think as a field, we probably do want to get to grips with what the ways in which laboratory effects might be influencing the outcomes that you're getting from the games. So yeah, it's a good point. So the pitch is that an experimental or analytical approach might address some of these limitations. So creating wargaming environments that are replicable so that we can actually perform causal inference, come up with generalizable conclusions that aren't process oriented, but that are outcome oriented, it's more than reasonable to carry out a one-shot war game and discuss the types of conversations that were had around the table, the kinds of things that were salient to the players. It's not appropriate on the basis of a one-shot war game to say, we think X is going to happen in the Baltic Sea because see my one-shot war game. And so, if we're actually interested in doing work on the outcomes, we need to try to create a replicable environment. It obviously provides an additional DGP for theory development and testing. So this is thinking about it more from a social science perspective. So what can you get out of this method that you can't from, say, survey methods or game theoretical approaches or what have you, and provides a new way of doing experimentation. So in social science research, we've done a lot of lab work and a lot of survey work, but haven't done a lot of work porting over wargaming methods as a potential tool. And arguably, compared to survey experiments, war games allow you to dial complexity up or down. And given that a lot of the questions that we're interested in, whether it be gray zone operations or cyber operations or what have you, one could argue that they are complex and thus, not appropriate for modeling from first principles as you would inside, say, a game theory theoretical approach. So yeah, that's. This is the kind of the pitch, if you will, of the method that as we're employing it. Yeah. So to Stephen's point, organizations often withhold the game raw data. That's exactly right. And so that makes it difficult for us on the analytical side, right, to adjudicate how the game design is actually influencing those set outcomes. Because ideally, right, you'd have all of that data available to try to unpack it and figure out what confounders in the design are impacting player behavior. So yeah, very good. Tim, I'll take your question here at the end, but it's a good one. And yeah, Stephen, that's exactly the point, right? We want to be able to, at least on the academic side, have disagreement about conclusions. I mean, there's nothing better from my perspective than a scholar picking up our signal design or the Tantalus design that I'll discuss later and changing something and running the experiment again. That's something that obviously you want on an academic side that you may or may not want as part of the consulting model. Although I would submit that ideally we're trying to provide the best answer for our customer. And so, if that involves opening up that data to peer review, that would be, I think, a useful endeavor from my perspective. But obviously, different shops run it differently, of course, and there's lots of equities involved. But certainly, I'm here probably more representing the academic side of the debate. But yeah, for me, more data equals better always, right? So yeah. So here's some of the discussion that's in a forthcoming article that'll be going into a cyber wargaming book. We kind of try to think about when we were doing the design of our experimental war games and analytical war games, what it was that we were weighing as we made this decision. And we kind of have this as a proposition. So in game design for analytical purposes, you're kind of weighing analytical utility on the one hand against contextual realism, that is the thing that you're trying to understand, and then engaging play. And so you're kind of building your war game instead of this simplex. And obviously games come, as you all know, in a variety of shapes and sizes. But it may be possible to say, okay, well, TTXs, they would tend to fall here in the simplex, and then maybe something like Signal that would fall elsewhere on the simplex. But in any case, right, we can move these designs around, and these are the things that we're really interested in kind of thinking about as we actually carry out game design. Of course, with the significant caveat is that there is no Goldilocks location on this simplex. Some games are going to be designed to be very playable, and some games are going to be designed to be very real. And other games are going to be designed to be very easy to use for analytical purposes. And that decision is being driven primarily by the research question that you're interested in and who your customer is. And so, this is the best way that we've come up with so far in trying to think about weighing these trade-offs. Just in terms of contextualizing these trade-offs, you could also put existing data generating processes within the simplex. So for example, simulation and modeling tools, lots of analytical utility, probably moves up and down contextual realism. Obviously engaging play is not something that they're even bothered with, Empirical approaches, lots of realism, obviously, it's observational data, but that observational data can be very difficult to package for analytical purposes as well. Survey experiments, they vary in terms of how easy they are to analyze, and they also vary with regards to how real they are, and also vary with regards to how easy they are for the research subject to actually engage with them. And then you've got traditional war games, which in my experience of them have always been very playable and kind of varied on this contextual realism axis, but that struggle on the analytical axis. Again, really absolutely appropriate to look at process-oriented questions with traditional, say, seminar-based games or TTXs, but when you start to make conclusions about outcomes, that's when things get a little bit hairy. And of course, in a self-serving manner, there's this argument that experimental wargaming or analytical wargaming fits right there, right in the middle of the simplex, and is a perfect, Goldilocks of all of these three factors. And again, we can argue about whether that's actually the case. I think the best way to kind of interpret what's going on here is that in general, empirical approaches are down and to the left. In general, simulation modeling towards the top. And we submit that you can do some pretty interesting things with analytical word games that are designed with replicability in mind to try to balance out these various aspects of the trilemma. Yeah. So Stephen, to the point there, we're not using it in the IPE sense. The IPE argument is that yes, you choose two of the trilemma. We're using trilemma as a shorthand from having to weigh three different sets of variables. So the pre-1973 version of trilemma rather than the IPE stealing of the term. But yeah, you could try to make the argument that any particular DGP might only be able to address two of the three. It's certainly the case for simulation modeling, empirical approaches, maybe also traditional war games, right? But I think for now, the pitch is that we can try to solve this trilemma a little bit by using wargaming as a method that has some immersion, that is designed with data in mind, and is trying to capture the central aspects of whatever conflict mechanism or dynamic that you're interested in. With regards to Mark's point, more data is better. That's directly in response to Stephen's comment, right? Yes, I want to know all of the data that's coming out of war game designs from RAND, CNA, et cetera, and I want to know what the designs look like. Insofar as we have no way to adjudicate currently laboratory effects. So we don't know whether, say, 3-player games and 5-player games are inherently different or whether they're not. We don't have any data to actually adjudicate those types of concerns. We have hunches, for example, the digital play might be different than analog play, but no data to adjudicate it. And it's not because the data doesn't exist. So that's the type of data that you're wanting. Yes, for sure. If you don't want to have data that's not appropriate for collection inside of the research design. But if you have a research design that's appropriately scoped, with the design what it is that you're going to be getting out of it, right? Yeah, Tim makes a good point there. Contextual realism and analytic utility might mutually reinforce. They can do, but if you've got really high on the realism, there's a lot of idiosyncratic behavior when you're looking at humans. And so that can make analytical stuff less clean, right? And if you're a game theorist or a simulation person, right, you might not particularly like that noise. But yeah, it's a good point. And yeah, Stephen, absolutely. So in our games, we always collect the demographic information to the best, to the extent that we can. We're particularly interested in the expertise question. So when we kind of first posited that this might be a useful tool for the community to use, there was some discussion as to who the appropriate player pool was. And some of Sebastian's colleagues, Abidol among them, suggested that, we should be sampling only elites for these types of questions. And I think my prior is that elites probably are the appropriate population to sample for a lot of these questions. But again, we don't have any data to adjudicate whether elites are all that different than, Joe Public or undergraduate students or what have you. In fact, some work from a colleague, Josh Kurtzer at Harvard, suggests that actually elites and non-elites aren't all that different from one another. But yeah, certainly you want to capture as much of that demographic information as you possibly can. And like I said, we're really focused on that expertise angle. So this is a work in progress. It'll be published hopefully over the summer, but kind of wanted to show it here first so that you could all see it, and kind of how we're thinking about the space. So, again, I don't really necessarily need to belabor this with you, but for those of you that are students within GUWS, I thought it'd be interesting for you to kind of see our process from nuts to bolts. So we always start our work with a research question. That research question yields the dependent variable for analysis, the independent variables for analysis, and the hypotheses that we're testing. Like any other good research design, these hypotheses are always falsifiable, and ideally you'd be pre-registering your experiment as well. We take that RQ, we think hard about what the experimental design looks like first. We emphasize hypothesis testing in our design. Obviously that has impacts on the playability, if you will, and also the extent to which you can deal with complexity. The more that you add into the game environment, occasionally, the more it would obfuscate your findings. And so you have to try to Goldilocks that. We subsequently choose game elements that reflect this design. So card-based, dice-based, hex-based maps, not hex-based maps, not having a map at all. All of those are kind of discussed there on the third phase. And that's really where we're doing a lot of the borrowing from, say, the likes of Peter Perla's work or the work of Phil Sabin, right? As you're trying to pull the best of the art of wargaming so that you're creating the most playable environment that you possibly can. Obviously, that yields an alpha version, so that at least we kind of have an idea of what those mechanics look like as a first blush. And then subsequently, you're beta testing. In our case, you're beta testing for months. And you're beta testing things like what color should tokens be, what color should countries be. Got lots of anecdotes to tell you about what happens when you make players blue or red, for example, and that led to our decision to make our countries green, purple, and orange, to try to get away from some of the dynamics that we were seeing when you said, okay, you're red and you're blue, for example. So beta testing, that'll go on for a long time. Often, then you field your experiment, obviously, and then on the back end, you do analysis. For Signal, we went from seminar-based TTX to board game to online game. Our next project, Tantalus, is going survey experiment into board game. So we're kind of interested in how doing that differently might look different. But that's certainly the way that we're trying it now, and more than happy to report back to the community as to how that goes. For the first blush for Signal, the reason that we did a TTX first was that we had a lot of questions given the RQ that we had about whether things like nuclear use were even appropriately playable. And so we wanted to see what the dynamics looked like when we brought in senior officials or former senior officials and senior academics into a room to actually play it out. And we felt pretty comfortable on the back of that TTX to continue on with the board game design reflecting that kind of rule set. And of course, as you move up here, the TTX had white cell adjudication. The board game does not. We did rules-based adjudication to try to deal with some of that replication challenge that I mentioned earlier. The board game and online game for Signal look very similar in terms of mechanics. There are one or two changes at the margins that were necessary, and more than happy to talk about the differences between an online versus an analog environment. I have to say, from my perspective, seeing research subjects play the board game has been really, really fun. I really am a fan of that particular medium for this type of work. The data collection is a challenge. We have about 45 board games in the data set from the board version. We have almost 2,000 players of the online version. So there's orders of magnitude more players on the online, but I have a soft spot in my heart for the board game play and seeing what players did, or across that board. And happy to talk about that during Q&A as well. So just to kind of, let's see here. Question from Yvette. Do you have any calculation tool for the beta testing, calculating numbers and the balancing? Yes. So we built Signal as a 3-player game, and we wanted to make sure that it was approximately balanced. So the numbers eventually came out to each player had in the 30%. chances of victory. I want to say that green was slightly less. Green and purple were slightly less. Orange had a slightly higher. So I think orange won something like 38% of the time, and then green and purple were fairly evenly split. But yes, to the extent to which balance might be important for our research question, we said that it was. That's the kind of data that you want to be collecting to make sure that you're not making something that's wildly out of whack. The challenge for us was, so just here, yeah, Pigeon, I'm with you. Board games help in immersing players, tactile and social. I think that that's a very fair thing to say on the back of what we observe with Signal. Yeah, very good. So with Signal, as I mentioned, we designed it to incorporate abstract states with the colors that I mentioned, orange, purple, and green. We had a 3-player game with a nuclear dyad. And so that really impacted that balancing component, Yvette. So for us, the orange player didn't receive nuclear capabilities, green and purple do. And so if you have a game where orange is always going to lose, that's a problem. But the reason that we decided to go with a 3-player design, for what it's worth, and again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the right design, but it's the design that our team ultimately decided was appropriate. And the reason for that was that our prior was that game theory does a really nice job with 2 players, but the math gets hard when you have 3 players. So let's do something a little bit different. We have the funding to do it. Let's do it. We also really use that 3rd player to drive competition. As you can imagine, an orange player that doesn't have nuclear capabilities between a purple and a green player that both do, right? You're seeing alliance dynamics, bandwagoning, et cetera, all things that we're interested in from the perspective of international security. And so wanted to kind of use that as a way to drive some of the competition. Tim, I've got it in a couple of slides here, but the question is, under what conditions do tailored nuclear capabilities alter the likelihood of nuclear use? So we're looking at the nuclear threshold in this particular study. And what we were doing was varying the nuclear capabilities provided to purple and green. So in some games, we had the symmetrical case where purple and green had tailored nuclear capabilities, say high precision, low yield nuclear weapons, versus situations where they did not. They only had high yield alternatives. So that was the experiment inside of the game. And so everything is kind of designed around that particular research question. The win conditions are also another thing that are beta tested significantly. We decided to go with 2 economic win conditions inside of the game. So, building as many towns and cities as you can, also garnering as many resources as you possibly can. And we have 1 security win condition, but framed negatively. So we weren't interested in building risk. We wanted to build a game where you had to protect your territory. So on its face, these win conditions don't suggest that you need to behave aggressively to quote unquote win the game. With that said, significant caveat, the win conditions are 0 sum insofar as you get points for winning each one of these categories. So if you have the most towns and cities, you get a point. You're getting 2 points. Second team gets 1 point, last team gets 0. And it is 0 sum in that way. So if you're a liberal theorist, you might be angry with this design because it's 0 sum in nature rather than positive sum in nature. But it's a conceit of having to do the game design, right? And one of the only ways that we thought that we could appropriately do it. Yes, yeah. So that was a choice. I have to say that during the design process, we had different win conditions. We did have territorial control and try to garner as many hexes as you can. Ultimately, that negative framing we thought was important, such that we weren't creating the conditions under which you were going to see very, very aggressive behavior all the time, right? Ideally, inside of these games used for experimental or analytical purposes, you would have end round games, which is to say that the players wouldn't know when the game was going to end. Those of you that have done work on iterative games will know why, right? If I know the game is only going to last 5 rounds, I should cheat on that last round and go crazy and try to get as much of the board as I can. And if I'm going to do that in round 5, I should probably do that in round 4. And if I'm doing that in round 4, I should probably do that in round 3, right? Backwards induction the whole way through. So ideally, players wouldn't know how long the game was going to last. That was true for us in the board game case. but is not true for us in the online game case. So again, really interesting laboratory effect to actually compare across the data. Yeah, Rex, exactly. Last turn madness, right? And so ideally you wouldn't have that. And that I think is an important critique of the wargaming method. So in the board game version, the game is designed to go anything from something like 3 rounds to 6 rounds. And we kind of have dev data across that distribution. With that said, in the board game environments, players do know that at 5 p.m. they're going to be leaving CSIS, or whoever's hosting us, KCL hosted us too, right? And so you're still getting some last time madness as the clock gets closer and closer to 5 p.m. So that's something that you need to deal with. And yes, as experimentalists, we also lie to our subjects, right? That's why IRB is so important, to make sure that our lying is appropriate. And then the last thing here is that across both the board and the online version of the games, we've instrumented it for data collection. So everything that we're doing is very much trying to capture data on our RQ. So obviously we know by random assignment who's getting the tailored nuclear capabilities and who's not. And then we're trying to look for those situations where players are, using nuclear weapons, and if they are using nuclear weapons, which types of nuclear weapons are they using, et cetera. One of the things I kind of liked about what we ultimately did here with this analysis was that we attempted to benchmark it against a DGP that's well established in the literature. So specifically, we built a survey experiment that, as close as you can, approximates the decision-making inside of the game environment. Why I love wargaming is that you get the immersion and the strategic interaction between players that you don't get in a survey. But I think it's important, particularly for political scientists and social scientists who have not a clue what wargaming is, that we do benchmark it against a method that's accepted in the field. And so broadly, our survey experiments results mirror those, although with different levels of statistical significance, mirror those of the online game, which is kind of neat. But that was one of the things that we did that was that I think important. For a little bit more on this, there's a couple of pieces. There's a piece in Science that kind of outlines experimental wargaming as an idea. There's a bulletin piece that speaks to the design, and then we have a forthcoming article that really dives into the design choices that we made. And that is really trying to serve a couple of purposes. I think the most important one is making clear to the wargaming community where we made very difficult decisions with regards to the design, and where others might want to pick up our design and do something slightly different. But we do want to be really transparent as to the choices that we made, in the hopes that, again, a grad student or somebody picks up the design and tests how this might look different if you had 4 players, for example. And obviously there's the game manual that's on OSTI, and that is packaged alongside all of the work that comes out of this portfolio. So yeah. Cool. Very good. This is the map. I know some of you have seen it. So this is the board game version. It's very pretty. We're quite proud of this one. And then the online version, a little bit less pretty. This certainly is not Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. So this is kind of Civ 1 circa 02. It's kind of level. But I think one of the nice things is that it would have cost orders of magnitude more to make this even 5, 6, 7 years ago than it does currently. So we leveraged Unity online tools. We leveraged Nakama, Amazon Web Services, to kind of pull this together. So all open source, so very, very doable. Not on a shoestring per se, but certainly orders of magnitude cheaper than it would have been before. So this is what it looks like. And I guess a couple of the features that I just mentioned is that obviously that chat data is really useful for us. You can do NLP on that, content analysis and what have you. And the other aspects. Yeah, Tim, I think we still have it up. It should still be live on the Berkeley server. Yeah. So, and then obviously you're on the bottom right here. These are the capability cards. You stage them. Oh, that's something I should have mentioned before, actually. So our rounds are composed of signaling phase, action phase, and upkeep phase. the thing that we kind of liked about what we did here in terms of a potential innovation was that there's a lot of literature on costly signaling, but again, no empirical test for it. And so we wanted to provide the conditions for costly signaling to be able to occur. And so what happens is you signal what you may do at the beginning of a round, and then you have an action phase where you actually make the choice to do it. And so we quite like that mechanic, and so wanted to highlight it here, so just in case it's of interest to any of you as you think about your own game designs. Perfect. So who plays? This is a really important question. As I mentioned, there was this back and forth as to, whether you want policy elites versus, undergraduate students to play these types of games. We had kind of three different ways of thinking about our sample. The first is convenience sampling, where, primarily I relied on my friends and colleagues and kind of arm twisted them to play. So that's a fairly, I guess, knowledgeable sample. It's predominantly postdocs and grad students, although we can have arguments about how elite you think that those particular communities are. We also used Amazon Mechanical Turk, a really nice tool for getting lots and lots of N. And we also use a laboratory setting. So we used the UC Berkeley Experimental Social Science Lab and actually had undergrads and graduate students play there. Some of the interesting top line findings from those engagements, some suggested that younger players like undergrads might be more aggressive inside of a game environment because they play Call of Duty all day. Actually, it turns out that our undergraduate students were the least aggressive of all of our sample types. So that's an interesting kind of unpacking of the data. We also, as I mentioned, did a number of events at think tanks with, massive thanks to CSIS and KCL's War Studies Department. We also went to military institutions, the national labs, across Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia all hosted various game events. Universities across both the United States and the UK, and also some IOs served as samples for us. And there, in those contexts, we predominantly did board games, but we also did a couple online plays as well. RUSI's we did an event with the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, which is one of their premier military think tanks. And that was pretty eye-opening. That was really neat, and that was online based. So yeah, and our hope is that, in some ways, Signal might have been better to be coming out now that we're all scrambling to do distributed wargaming. But as an online environment before, there were definitely some folks who were, what am I going to do with this computer game? Give me a TTX design instead. So yeah, Tim, that's right. Yeah. So, and this is just a picture of the board game in practice. So we stole some pieces from Monopoly, among others, in the game design. So onto data analysis. So what types of data do we get from war games? At base, my proposition is that we should treat data from war games in a similar manner to data from survey work, but noting that you get additional really interesting units of analysis to leverage for analysis from wargame environments that you don't get from surveys. So specifically, because you're getting strategic interaction on gameplay inside of a wargame environment, I have game outcomes as one set of data, and I have player behaviors inside of the game as another set of behavior. And so I can kind of look across those different data generating processes for conclusions. And so that's really nice. And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side here is the probability of nuclear first use or nuclear use using the player as the unit of analysis. And here, for example, you'll see that inside of our sample set, those that reported that they were female, they had a statistically significant less likely to use nuclear weapons first. Those that report knowledge of nuclear issues also statistically significantly less likely to use nuclear weapons first. And so you can get that out of the player data that you can't get out of the game data. And so we thought that's an interesting wrinkle, and so wanted to highlight that for you all here. Alternative units of analysis that you're also able to get out of here. So you've got game and player game that I just mentioned. You also have player round and sample player game. So player round would be diving into, okay, in round one, what's my player doing in round two? And so you have a temporal time series element to this data as well. So, and then obviously with that data analysis, right, you would do the kind of the normal stuff, right? So I'm a social scientist and we're all about regressions and survival models or hazard models when you've got temporal data. So that's what, most of the work that has been done on this data is, because I did it. But you can imagine more exotic ML tools being used on it as well. Although I will say that there's probably diminishing returns to doing stuff that's super fancy on the data. I mean, ultimately, if you've got a well-designed experiment, you shouldn't need to bludgeon your data to get the outcome. And in fact, one of the things that we always do is that because you've got the full set of hypotheses, we don't care whether our finding is that tailored nuclear capabilities increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood or have no effect on the likelihood of nuclear use. Either way, that's super interesting and contributes to a literature that's entirely theoretically driven. And so, we're pretty agnostic as to what the finding is. For what it's worth, the finding overall is that tailored nuclear weapons appeared to have a positive effect on the likelihood of nuclear use. And there's a substitution effect, as players with tailored nuclear weapons are more likely to use those weapons over high yield nuclear weapons. And that's consistent across the data set. Although it's important to say that, this is not, that's not a significant finding across all ways to cut the data. But all to say that, you can do some pretty simple data analysis and get some pretty nice insights out of the data here. So yeah, whenever you're doing data analysis, right, you're interested in various types of validity. By virtue of being an experiment, it's internally valid, period. Face validity, that's something that you're trying to get out of the beta testing. So, if the game doesn't look right or it doesn't seem real, if the win conditions are wrong, right, that's going to impact somebody playing the game and saying, yeah, it doesn't have face validity for me. The feedback that we've received, presenting this work in conferences and getting publications out, a lot of hangups on external validity of wargaming methods. And there, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to that, right? Like ultimately, no matter what your synthetic DGP is, you have to make an argument as to why your findings are relevant. I would argue that wargaming methods compared to survey methods, or wargaming methods compared to formal models, offer a lot more external validity, or at least they get a little bit closer to having humans in the loop with the decision making and have more contextual realism baked in. So external validity is a question of by degree. And ultimately, that's why I think it's most useful for those questions where we don't have empirical data. Because if you did have it, well, if you want external validity, just go and sample the real world, right? Don't go sampling wargame players. But obviously that's something that we can worry about on the margins. And so definitely wanted to, again, highlight that discussion is something that often comes up in Q&A and happy to chat about that. Also, as I mentioned, right, because it's a new tool, at least for social science, obviously I know it's been around for a long time on the practitioner side. You want to try to validate it against existing DGPs. Like I said, we did it against a survey experiment. If you can find analogous empirical data, maybe imperfectly analogous, you might want to do that. So we were interested in an escalation question. And so maybe you can marry it to various other types of escalation that are below the nuclear threshold, given that we only have an N of 1 or 2, depending on what you're counting there. And similarly with case studies. And so I think one of the next steps for the literature, I'm not sure that, certainly not our next project is not going there, but we might consider creating an analytical wargaming framework that has empirical data attached to it in order to look at where the divergence might live between wargaming data and the empirical data. And so that would be kind of casting off the use case that I suggested, which is that is most useful for when we don't have empirical data. But in order to actually get to grips with what the method provides, I think that'll be a really useful thing for us to consider doing as a community. And again, happy to talk about that later. Yeah, so this is kind of recasting what I said before. I mean, I think ultimately it's most useful where we don't have data, and that's the case for a lot of things that we're interested in. Certainly me as an academic, certainly me as an engineer at the lab, things like crisis decision making, gray zone operations, cyber warfare, for various reasons, getting data on these issues is very difficult. Well, wargaming might provide a useful method to kind of unpack some of that and shed some light on it. The effect of nascent military capabilities on conflict, I mentioned right up top. New strategies on conflict, the same. Ultimately, we don't know what happens when we shift a strategy before we do it. And so, if you can kind of play that out a few times in a replicable way, you're going to get something useful out of it potentially. Yeah, very good. As I mentioned, past work, this was the question that we were answering. Under what conditions do nuclear weapons affect the likelihood of nuclear use? The next project is looking at cyber deterrence. We are one among many teams looking at the cyber problem. We're particularly interested in the conditions under which players make deterrent threats and under what conditions deterrence is likely to fail. And so deterrent threats is our dependent variable here. And we're interested in how the domain of the threat and the specificity of the threat, that is the target that is pointed towards and the vector, whether it's say a DDoS attack or malware or what have you, impacts the likelihood of say blue making a deterrent threat or deterrence failure becoming more or less likely. Of course, this occurs against the backdrop of a litany of scholars that are suggesting that cyber deterrence is not possible in the cyber domain. But again, we rely almost entirely on theoretical work to make that argument. We don't have any empirics. And so we've chosen yet another research question here where we think that wargaming data has something useful to add. And so this work is under the Pegasus brand at Sandia. It's the Tantalus game itself. And so you'll be seeing some of that work from us over the next year or so. The survey experiment is being used to design that game is getting deployed here in the next month. So yeah. Lots of sources, some of whom are in the room. I think I saw Peter show up, which is awesome. My colleagues on the poli-sci side that are, you might be interested in looking at their work. Eric Lynn Greenberg, who runs the MIT Wargaming Working Group, Reed Polly, who's at Brown, Jackie Schneider, who's at Hoover. We were pulling on literature from Brandon Green and Austin Long on Conceal Reveal for that Tantalus project. And this here is the article that's forthcoming, the Wargames as data addressing the Wargamers Trilemma. So you'll see some stuff from us here in the not too distant future. So yes. Yeah, you can cite Jervis and psychological drivers of conflict. We don't do it in this slide deck, but you absolutely could. Rose McDermott is another one whose work we often riff off of and are cited in our papers. So yeah, lots of good scholarship that have looked at the unit level of decision making that we're drawing on to suggest that wargaming data is appropriate. So with that, I will turn things over to questions. I know I tried to grab some of them as we were going, and then yeah, I'm happy to have a chat. And I know, Robert, you're going to do some moderating of these, so happy to do it, and happy to leave my slides up or to pull them down. And do feel free to get in touch, areddie@sandia.gov or areddie@berkeley.edu.
Yeah, so Andrew, first of all, a great presentation, and thank you again for sharing your time with us this evening. As far as questions go, honestly, I think you did a phenomenal job of preempting those throughout the presentation. I've got one or two here scribbled down, but from what I was tracking, it seems that you addressed most of them. I would also ask folks if they're, maybe you asked a question earlier and didn't address it or got kind of mixed up. Feel free to toss that in there or remind us. But it seems I think you kind of addressed most of them, or at least I saw this evening. But as you can see, there's some more pouring in here as well. So feel free to jump at those if you want.
Perfect. I see from Tim, this is Lincoln Bloomfield Redux. Yes, because Lincoln Bloomfield, we have the data for. So Reed Polly's excellent IS article dives into the Bloomfield shelling archives. So we have that material. So yes, absolutely. Certainly an inspiration for that work. Reynolds asked, was there a correlation between first use, nuclear use, and winning/losing? No, not in a significant pattern. We had players who used, in fact, the experiment is over, so I can share this now, I suppose. But using nuclear weapons actually does not make you more likely to win the game. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, we tried to create a game framework that was, you know, we didn't want to create these like weird costs that were about a taboo or arms control or what have you. You know, and insert those into the game. We just gave the players the capabilities and then tracked whether they used them or not. And that was, you know, what they brought to the table. That's what we collected. I think one of the nice things about our experiment, because we were looking at a difference in nuclear capability type, that, you know, it was less a question of, well, do you use nuclear weapons? It was more of, well, do those that have these tailored nuclear capabilities, do they use them more or less or what have you? So that was interesting. But yeah, in beta testing, I've yet to lose signal, and I almost never use nuclear weapons. And that's the anecdotal version that we see in the data. It doesn't make you more likely to win. So that's great. Cyber deterrence, yes, Tim. Jackie's also interested in this question. And the International Crisis Wargame is a very good distributed wargame for those that are interested in it. One of the interesting things about the International Crisis Wargame is that the data collection is all happening in the first round, and that's not the case for Signal. We're collecting across the game rounds, and so, you know, that's for those of you that are TTX designers, you'll know that, you know, as you give the white cell some choices as to kind of what happens next, you have a choice. Either you kind of create a decision tree model and say, well, the players want to do this, and so your round 2 is going to look like X, right? But if they did that, then it's going to look like Y. And so you end up with kind of a decision tree model. The other way to do it, of course, is to try to pull your players back into the same round 2, regardless of what they decide to actually do in round 1. And so, you know, ultimately for us, like there's certainly path dependence. What happens in round 1 affects what happens in round 2, just like in the real world. Other designs, that's less the case. Any specific challenges or lessons learned? Those two games are going to look very, very different to each other, to the extent that Tantalus currently does not have a map, because you don't need a map if you're interested in whether players are going to play a deterrent threat card, and whether they're deterred. And so really the RQ dictates what the design should look like. And we're more than happy to beg, borrow, and steal from all of the literature on the, you know, kind of on the art side of the field, to use in this context. I mean, what are the challenges with regard to Signal? I mean, there's numerous, right? So deploying it online, you're a victim of the bandwidth of your research subjects, which is not always awesome. So for example, the analysis, I said that, you know, we ended up with something like 2,000 players playing something like 800 to 1,000 games. But for exclusion criteria, I only analyze the data for those games where we have all 3 players there inside the game environment. And so we ended up losing I think it was about a third of games had a player drop for one reason or another. And so that's a challenge. Then we also ended up with some browser challenges on the Unity and Nakama design. So, you know, the Chrome, for example, worked fairly well. Internet Explorer / Edge did not. Safari didn't work very well. And so those are the kind of the technical challenges that obviously we're going to be trying to address in the subsequent design of Signal. In terms of the design itself, you know, I think ultimately we're fairly happy with it. But, you know, again, we expect and want scholars, the practitioner community, to pick up the design and do something different with it. And we're committed to providing the transparency to do that, whether it's via the game manual or you know, publishing the data along with the academic articles, et cetera. And so, you know, we're hopeful that, you know, we'll be able to eventually move the field forward in terms of laboratory effects in that manner. Struggles or insights on the game design process? Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the most significant argument that we had as a team was how you make sure that inside of the nuclear capability set, you created the conditions for a secure second strike capability. You don't want upon round one, the ability for an adversary to take nuclear weapons off the table of their adversary, right? That wouldn't be very quote unquote real. And so one of the ideas that a colleague had was to put like a nuclear barrage button that could always be pressed. But obviously from like an analytical perspective, now you're disaggregating between different types of nuclear things that are happening inside of the game. So it's not very clean. So we ultimately relied more on the math and just making sure that that secure second strike was always possible. And that if you wanted to do a barrage nuclear attack, you had the ability to do so because you had multiple nuclear cards in your toolkit. And you certainly, we didn't make the nuclear weapons outlandishly expensive because, to be quite frank, they're not outlandishly expensive. And so that was how we ended up dealing with that problem. But that was a lot of back and forth inside of the team as to, what the, comparative advantages or disadvantages of the various design considerations would be for that problem. And again, kind of demonstrates the degree to which the analytical aspect really drove what the final game looked like. Because ultimately there, we were making a potential trade-off in terms of contextual realism in order to make sure that the analysis stayed clean. And you can all guess which side of that I was on as the social scientist. But that was where I think we had the most significant struggle. With regards to insights, I think particularly comparing the board and the online game, chat in the online game wasn't much of a thing, whereas chat over the board was a very significant thing. Really fun anecdotes of players, particularly at CSIS, that sample pool. They would take their nuclear cards and they would put them in the corner of the big hall that we were using and saying, okay, that's my disarmament regime. Or they would put them underneath the board, or they would try to come up with like no first use policies and whatnot. And that was kind of very rich and interesting and didn't happen as much in the online environment, which suggests to me that there's significant differences between online and analog environments that are ripe for us to analyze and look at and take seriously in terms of using the game outcomes as data to look at various things that we're interested in with regards to international security. So those are just some, Sebastian, but it's a great question. I'll probably think of more as we go on here. But yeah, I'll go for Stevens. Not a lot with regard. So Stephen asked, for those of you that can't see the chat, how much data do you have from real world professionals? I guess it depends what you mean by professional. If it's via these exclusion criteria, senior policymakers, generals, admirals, senior politicians, and diplomats playing the game, some. You're talking about 10s to 20s, mostly of the board game, because they had no interest in playing the online game. Maybe they would be different now. If Signal had been released as an experiment during COVID, maybe we would have more luck getting them to play the online version. But really, when it was with senior policymakers, it needed to be tactile. And then, of course, that population of folks were the folks that played the TTX at Livermore right at the beginning of the project. So yeah. But in terms of the overall sample, when you're talking about very, very, very senior, not much. And that's captured in our age data, right? So if I go back here, hopefully you can see, yep, here we go. So we do our age cutoffs at 29. So by convention in the survey literature, the age cutoff's 49. So we're looking at how over 50 and older compared to younger than 50. Here we do 30, given who our sample is, right? So yeah, your sample really matters. That said, we do bifurcate the data based on whether people are self-reporting knowledge of nuclear and international security issues and whether they have a job in national security, right? So those are the demographic proxies for quote unquote experience. But certainly you're not going to get the types of folks that you were talking about, at least at that point, to play a video game. Again, maybe that's shifted some, but not back in 2018, 2019. Have you created Vassal? Yeah, so we use Vassal to spec the board game and to design it. And actually, we now have an in-house Sandia tabletop simulator that we use. So yes, Vassal is a very powerful tool to very quickly iterate on the game mechanics. So yes, Reynolds, that's right. Sebastian, did you see any differences in player behavior from their first-time player and their follow-on? Yeah, although not markedly so, at least in terms of what we're pulling out. So we're pulling out nuclear use. So perhaps if we were looking at the margins of various other types of military things or economic things, we'd see different play. It didn't make a marked difference on the probability of winning. That's the important, well, that's what we viewed as being one of the important ones. But yeah. Obviously, you do want to track whether they're a first-time player. Interestingly for us, we had to track first-time play across various different in various different ways, because it could have been the case that we had a sample that had played the TTX or that had played the board game and then that subsequently played the online game. And so in the demographic survey, we have to capture all that. So there was almost a question that said, like, have you come across Signal in its various iterations ever before? And that's obviously coded as a 1. And then specifically, have you played the online game before? That's coded as a 1. Because yes, you'd be worried that there's a metagame associated with it. And I think, to be fair, I mean, particularly in analytical games and like coming from a university setting, I mean, we're not StarCraft 2 designers. It's not going to be perfectly balanced, and arguably StarCraft 2 sometimes isn't balanced. That's why we keep patching it. So certainly the meta game is a challenge, but compared to again, what's it being compared against? Compared against a survey experiment, compared against a game theoretical model, our sense is that it's fairly compelling. Yeah, Stephen. So that's right. So we did play it with a few folks that were inside government currently. Oftentimes, for what it's worth, that's a problem with a lot of more traditional war games too. We end up with a lot of former officials who may or may not be behaving the same way as they would when they're inside of government. But yeah, that's right. Is there an effort to capture more of those national decision makers? Absolutely. We want to adjudicate this elite versus non-elite question. So Kurtzer finds that there's no difference looking at survey data. Well, do we find the same in wargaming data? I think that's a really interesting question, and we can only do it by capturing those data sources or those samples. My prior, as I mentioned, would be that there would be differences between a policymaking elite and Joe Public, but it's a testable proposition, and we need to test it. So yeah, don't trust anybody over 30. That's fair enough, Tim. Adam, have you thought about how to create games to address organizational, bureaucratic structure and decision-making related research questions? Yes. So we do have a project that looks at how to develop consensus making in a NATO context. So that's directly tied into customer work. And so that's much more at the organizational bureaucratic level. So yeah, we do some of that too. What was the balance between conventional employment of military forces and nuclear options? Far more conventional, as you'd expect, inside of the game. You also, for some of the game conditions, you just had far more. I mean, so we coded by color the capabilities. So if memory serves, I think nuclear weapons were blue, conventional military capabilities were red. And so the distribution of blue and red in the bar looked different across the game conditions, but they had way more conventional. And so you could argue that by virtue of having more red available, more conventional available, you're just more likely to see more conventional use. So that's a confounder that you need to try to address. So yeah, what's some advice that you would give to other social science researchers aiming to design their own experimental game? Do it. It's really, I know, or at least for me, getting to now speak to the wargaming community and be a part of the academic community has been very enriching. So, I've definitely enjoyed this work. In terms of the process, I think that the process needs to look something like the process that I showed earlier. And, ultimately your analysis needs to be RQ driven. You also need to decide it up top is your question amenable to the method? if you have lots of observational data to answer your question, why are you wasting your time with synthetic DGPs? Like, what, there can be logics for doing it, but you know, you really, as a researcher, you should ask that question and make sure that you answer it, because obviously that's going to impact the kind of the journals that are going to be saying, well, is this appropriate? Is this not appropriate? But yeah, it's entirely RQ driven, and the process kind of flows from there. The thing that needs to happen from my perspective to make this a viable method for large scale social science research is the ability for us to sandbox some of these capabilities, so that we have a basket of mechanics, say maps, etc., that can be very quickly spun up and easily used to, you know, for a graduate student to engage with. You know, graduate students don't have tens of thousands of dollars in grant money to engage with this stuff. They need help along the way. So one of the very long-term visions that the team that I'm on has is to try to develop some of those sandbox capabilities to make it easier. With that said, I mean, those of you that have coded in Unity and Nakama, et cetera, they're not the most difficult tools in the world to use, and they are open source. So it's not as if the social scientist doesn't get to pick them up and use them. But you know, I think certainly if you're looking to deploy online and get lots of N, then we as a community need to make it easier for that to happen. And so, you know, maybe that's still 5 years away, but no harm in being at the vanguard of that. I would also say that experimental or analytical war games can come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. We played an analytical experimental wargaming design at KCL. I worked on a project with Dr. Heather Williams, focused on social media nuclear issues and elite communications associated with that. And that was, you know, a PowerPoint-based experimental wargame design that we played roughly 10 times. So, you know, it certainly doesn't have the statistical validity, if you will, of say something like Signal, where you've got 400N. But for some empiricists, 400N still isn't very much. So, you know, it's approachable in a variety of different contexts, and how fancy you make it is entirely driven by your RQ. So it's a very good, very good question. Stephen asks, survey data describes what people say they would do. Yeah, that's exactly right. A war game describes what decisions people actually make. Yeah, that's what we see. The immersion is what we really like about the method. The game is not the real world. That's true. The survey is not the real world. The formal model is not the real world. The simulation might have a lot of stuff in it, but it may also not be the real world. So yeah, I think the bash on survey work is that very problem. And so, you know, when my colleagues in social science that are very used to survey methods say, well, you know, you have an external validity problem, I say, well, do you not with your synthetic DGP? I'm pretty sure that you do, you know, for these questions where we don't have empirical data. And that's the bar, right? The bar isn't to match the real world. The bar is to say something meaningful about how the real world might look. And so I think that by creating, the proposition that I'm making is that by creating environments where you're allowing players to be immersed, take part in strategic interaction, you're maybe more likely to get that data that might be interesting for these questions that, you know, are largely theoretical because they have to be. So yeah, Stephen, couldn't agree more. How do you correlate between the survey responses, gameplay? So we really do that, those first two. So we look at the same dependent variable, the same independent variable. What we're varying inside the survey experiment is also the presence or absence of tailored nuclear capabilities in a dyadic form. And so we run exactly the same models in the survey form as well as the game form. There is a conceit in the survey insofar as, you know, we only had funding to run a 3-round survey experiment. So I only got to do 3 scenarios. And so I chose 3 scenarios that I thought were appropriately, potentially escalatory and competitive. And so the 3 scenarios that I chose one was an adversary puts a military base on a near ally. some of you will know the real world case that I'm referring to here, right? So that was the first one. One of them was your adversary places their nuclear forces on alert. And the other one was your adversary employs a cyber attack on your territory that has physical effects. And so, of all of the things that could happen in Signal, I could only choose 3. And so that's the data that I've got. So any particular finding from the survey, that's the caveat that comes with it. But of course, I think, again, the nice thing about doing this in an academic context is that the survey design is the appendix of the article. So all of that is, well discussed. And again, there's no right way to do this. There's just the transparent way to do it. And so, that's what you'll always find from me with regards to this particular method. With regards to real world decisions, we don't for the Signal data. Maybe we could use some of, say, Thomas Ridd's data for cyber, for Tantalus, but that's a pretty significant maybe. I think that the best case for using analogical empirical data would be something like the International Crisis Behavior Data Set or something similar, and then look for the same kind of dynamics. Because really what a war game is yielding you over time, if time's your x-axis and your escalation number is your y-axis, it's giving you a distribution of a player strategy across time. And so you could look for that same distribution of strategy in real world data. But we certainly haven't done it yet, but it's something that you potentially could do. I think what I would probably want to do is to have a war game that's explicitly designed around a question that we have empirical data for, like, say, nuclear proliferation, which would be a left of Signal game that I proposed lots of times and think that we should do because we have data on proliferation. And so we can compare it against that. Sebastian asked a good question. Experimental wargaming is increasing in academia. What are your impressions of the wider academic community as a tool of analysis? So yeah, I mean, actually, I think arguably some of Eric Lynn Greenberg and Jackie's work predates some of ours. Ours is just at a larger scale in terms of N. Brendan Valeriano and Ben Jensen are some other scholars working in the space. David Banks is another one. I think across the board thus far, the N's are fairly small, and some of them look more like survey experiments than others. There definitely is a line at which a game becomes a game, and we can make an argument as to whether some of those existing researchers that are using games are actually getting there. We obviously have to be really careful as well about what the data is. And so, if you're doing a real world seminar-based game and you're pulling individuals with surveys, the thing that you're analyzing is the group decision making, not the individual. And so we've run into some problems there in the academic community. But it's really nice to see an increasing number of scholars pick up the method and become interested in the method. The MIT Wargaming Working Group, similar to GUWS, I mean, the pipeline is there, and there's definitely people that are interested, as various panels at ISA and APSA demonstrate. And so, I think that the method is pretty compelling, and I'm trying to make the compelling case for it here. You can all suggest whether I'm doing it well or poorly. But yeah, I think that there's definitely an appetite, and we're only going to get better at it. And so we as an academic community need to learn, hey, what's the difference between a 4-player game and a 6-player game? What's the difference between a team versus an individual playing a game? What's the difference between an analog and a digital game? We don't have answers to these questions. These are all questions that have been asked and answered for other DGPs, not for wargaming. So we're at the very, very beginning of this stuff, for sure. Pigeon, yeah, that's right. A lever to get more funding. And I think one of the nice things is that we're getting to the point where we have enough scholars that are writing in the field that it's a thing. I mean, there are, I want to say, 4 ISA panels that touch various aspects of wargaming. There's book projects, there's edited volumes like the one that I mentioned on cyber wargaming. And so, I think the hope is that some of that will follow. When someone played the game multiple times, did their moves stay consistent? No, primarily because the odds of them being the same color are very, very vanishingly low. So we randomly assign the player to the to orange, purple, or green. So they're not going to be able to play the same country multiple times. inside of the game environment. Robert, I think I hit most of these, but I'm more than happy to, if there are others that I've missed.
No, from my count, I believe you're correct. Again, you've done a phenomenal job of going through every one of these questions here. Oh, there we go. No one from Sebastian here. Feel free to finish off on that one if you want.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, my pet project, like I mentioned, is the left of signal game. I think that insofar as we can change signal such that we to look at players making decisions about investing in new capabilities, I think that'll be a really interesting question, and also allow us to do that empirical validation, because we have proliferation data from the nuclear latency scholarship of, say, Rachel Whitlark and Rupal Mehta, Molly Berkheimer, also on just the straight up proliferation scholarship from Singh and Wei and Eric Gartsky and Matt Kronig and others. So I think that's the one that I'm really keen to make. I'm also pretty excited by the cyber deterrence question. For what it's worth, and you can book this on, gosh, whatever day this is, April 6th, 5th, 6th. I'm very skeptical as to whether deterrence is a thing in cyberspace, and so I'm very interested in that data as well. Some of the more exotic designs that I'm interested in as well are, how we should think about space as a geography for doing some war game design, and then the problem that we all have when we look at cross-domain problems, because I think there is a need to think about a lot of these things in concert rather than in isolation. How do you create game environments that appropriately capture undersea, on sea, on land, in atmosphere, exo-atmosphere, right? That I think is a really big challenge that both the art of wargaming folks and the science of wargaming folks both face, because I think there's a good case to be made that, like I said, that a lot of these domains operate in concert rather than being in isolation from one another. All the war games is the answer. Yeah.
Andrew, I wanted to thank you for your fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us, and we'll keep an eye out on your very interesting work that you have ahead of you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Appreciate it. And thank you to the Georgetown University Wargaming Society for having me, and to all of you for excellent questions. I look forward to seeing all of you at various connections and mores and et cetera. So yeah, so really happy to be a part of the community and look forward to following everybody's work.